Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Thursday, June 5th, day 608 of the war. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob. Thanks for joining me this very early for me and very late for you.
You always make a point of saying that. I appreciate it. Good to see you again, Amanda.
I just want our listeners to understand why I'm fumbling so much today.
And why I sound like I'm half asleep? Good.
Exactly. So now that we're all on the same page, let's begin. And Jacob will fill us in on a slew of announcements from U.S. President Donald Trump, which happened in my overnight. We'll also learn the results of a United Nations Security Council vote, and we'll hear about a glimmer of potential progress in the hostage release negotiations and ceasefire talks. All of this and more when we're back.
The law basically assumes that the enemy force you are fighting may not care about your civilians, but it certainly cares about its own civilians. What do we do in a reality where you're dealing with an enemy that the suffering of their civilian population is inherent to their war strategy? Now, that doesn't absolve us of our obligations. Hamas's inhumanity does not absolve us of the obligation for humanity. But the context that it creates, I think, is critical to the conversation, and it's very lacking.
I agree, but when democracies fight back against terror groups, they have to fight on two fronts. They have to both fight on the terms that have been laid out by the terror group, and the second thing you have to fight back is by preserving the norms of a democracy. We're forced to ask these moral questions about what we are and what we do, but based on an enemy that is not playing by the rules. But that's what we decide to be a part of by being the family of nations. And as Jews, we say, like every morning in our prayers, we say, Anachnu Amcha b'nei britecha. We choose to be the people of God's covenant, meaning we tie ourselves to an aspiration of justice and righteousness.
I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. So over Israel's night, we heard a slew of announcements from U.S. President Donald Trump, including a ban on certain nations for tourist visas to the United States. And what is interesting and important for the Times of Israel is that President Trump connected this ban with the Colorado flamethrower attack on Sunday. But interestingly enough, among these different nations, the nation from which the attacker came is not on the list. So who is on the list, Jacob?
Right, so Egypt, where the attacker is from, not on the list. We had 12 countries who have just blanket bans, and those include Afghanistan, Myanmar, Chad, the Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Haiti, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. And then there are 7 more countries that have very strict restrictions, but not blanket bans. Some of these countries, there's some overlap from the so-called Muslim ban during Trump's first term, where you had a slate of Muslim majority countries whose residents were barred from entering the U.S. But some of these countries are new. And as you noted, did not include Egypt, even though the Trump made a point of saying that the attack in Boulder on these activists for Israeli hostages earlier this week was kind of the impetus for this decision, this executive order. And it was even teased during a meeting earlier on Wednesday with Jewish leaders, where basically administration officials said, against the backdrop of this attack, these are the types of steps we're going to be taking in order to try and help better secure both the Jewish community in the U.S. and just broader the Americans in general.
So, of course, this puts the American Jewish leadership in a bit of a bind because traditionally, at least, this leadership is very pro-immigration, of course, noting the Jewish story itself and how the United States was eventually a great shelter to Jewry from around the world. So what are you hearing so far from the Jewish leadership, or is it just too early to tell?
I think it's a little early, but I think as it was with some of these these executive orders that President Trump passed regarding campuses and these various steps that he's taken, in addition to the one that he took, this executive order on travel bans, there was also one also taken against banning any foreign students from entering Harvard, including in the coming semester. So that's really going to throw up any sort of plans that people had, even if they'd already been accepted. The other steps that have been taken against universities were supposed to take another year to go into place, but this is more immediate. At the same time, The travel ban, there's still time until it goes into effect on Monday, I believe. So I'm sure there'll be court cases like there were in the first term on the Muslim ban that required kind of a redo of the policy a little bit, but still managed to move forward after that. I would expect to see similar cases to try to slow this decision down. But in general, I think there's probably a little bit of discomfort. Maybe there are definitely certain Jewish organizations on the more conservative end of the spectrum who appreciate the steps that Trump is taking. On the other hand, I think the decision to make these decisions that are broader policy decisions about immigration, about anti-Semitism or Jews, I think is a cause of concern for a lot of these Jewish organizations that feel that this could maybe lead the pendulum to swing the other way and have Jews be also the focus of decisions to reverse some of these decisions. I think obviously there's an appreciation for the quick response from the Trump administration, from Jewish organizations, but I think the way that it's going about it and kind of taking a hammer to the policy of immigration and making it about Jews as he does it is, I think, something that's going to make a lot of these Jewish organizations uncomfortable.
So, for the first time since President Trump has taken office, there was a resolution at the United Nations Security Council calling on the end for war. The resolution, as I understand it, called for a ceasefire, the release of the hostages, and a surge of humanitarian aid into the Strip. The results were basically as expected. So, what happened during the conversation, shall we say, over this resolution?
So definitely expected that this was going to fall. I think the fact that it was 14 countries all voting in favor, and not just some abstaining. I think oftentimes you'll have countries like the UK, or sometimes even France, that are permanent members that vote, even if they're not going to vote with the US, they're not going to vote against the US. But they didn't abstain on this, and I think it does show, I guess, what these resolutions, even though they're oftentimes very toothless and I think oftentimes don't mean so much, but they are a bit of a barometer of where the international community is and just show that it's really basically the U.S. and Israel against the world is probably not the message that Israel likes to see, but still I think that there's appreciation for the U.S. decision to veto in this case. And the conversation that you talked about ahead of the vote and after the vote, you had most notably the U.S. ambassador, Dorothy Shea, kind of the interim ambassador until I guess now it's Mike Waltz, who the former national security advisor. He hasn't had a confirmation hearing, but that's his job eventually. And she lists some of the reasons why the U.S. could not support this decision, this resolution, that she argues that it basically emboldens Hamas and undermines the ongoing diplomatic efforts to try to achieve a ceasefire that the U.S. is engaged in with Qatar and Egypt. And the argument is that it draws this false equivalence between the U.S. and Hamas and calls for an unconditional release, an unconditional ceasefire, which she argues simply allows Hamas to remain in power. And that was something I took note of because I think it's very similar to some of the language you hear out of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and to hear it coming from the U.S. government after there had been a little bit more of a gap between the Biden administration and the Israeli government. Now it really seems that they're in lockstep, at least on this specific issue at the UN. And that was something that I definitely took note of. And I think there were various other reasons that were given for why the U.S. couldn't vote for it. There wasn't a clear conditionality between the release of the hostages and the end of the war, which is something that Biden administration officials also talked about when they explained why they couldn't support certain resolutions that were kind of similar to this one. But bottom line, this is something that was kind of expected. The U.S. is not going to back any sort of ceasefire resolution at this stage. They are hoping to try to get the ceasefire through the temporary truce that Witkoff is negotiating, but they want it to be on their terms and not the terms of these 10 countries that are non-permanent members at the Security Council. They felt that the U.S. did that this was kind of a performative initiative that wasn't really aimed at creating results on the ground.
Right. I think, as you said, the only result on the ground is to clarify the stances of the different nations, including the UK, as you mentioned, and the relationship between the United States and Israel. And I'm not so sure if some parts of the Israeli government aren't happy to have this clarification that it is indeed the US and Israel against the world, because for some parts of the government, that is actually a selling point, a talking point at least. But Jacob, Since you mentioned already the hostage release negotiation efforts, yesterday you reported at least that there seems to be some kind of glimmer of potential progress. So let's end the first half with a recap of what's going on there.
Sure. So the glimmer comes from this optimism that was expressed not only by Steve Witkoff during his meeting with hostage families at the White House on Tuesday. There were a group of them that came in and met with Witkoff and Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, Susie Wiles, the White House chief of staff, and Howard Lutnick, the Secretary of Commerce. Some of these people had never met some of these families before, so that was a first for them, and it was said to be a very emotional and meaningful meeting. But during the sit down, Witkoff, according to several officials, several sources I spoke with involved in the meeting, that he did express optimism about a chance for a breakthrough in the coming days. And what he specifically was talking about is the idea that maybe the Qatari, Egyptian, and his point man, Bashar Bahbah, who is the Palestinian American who's been trying to negotiate behind the scenes, all these different mediators are hoping to lean on Hamas to soften the proposal that it submitted on Saturday. Because on Saturday, it submitted its response to the Witkoff proposal. It basically submitted the response and then made a series of edits to it. Those 13 points that we were actually able to publish last week. And those different edits were seen as unacceptable to Witkoff, who quickly, I think later that day or on Sunday, said that this is completely unacceptable and takes us backwards. And as a result, since that time, we've had efforts by the different mediators to try to get Hamas to soften at least some of the points that it put forward on Saturday. And speaking to various sources involved, their understanding is that there is progress in getting that sort of softened proposal from Hamas, specifically to try to get it before the Eid al-Adha, the Muslim holiday that's going to be celebrated on Friday. That there's hope that even if there might not necessarily be a deal by then, what the thought is that you first get this breakthrough, Hamas softens its proposal, and then you're able to hold what Witkoff called on Saturday to be proximity talks to basically nail down the final details of the deal. Specifically, even in the proposal that he put forward, it says that we still need to focus on or figure out the exact parameters of the Israeli partial withdrawal from Gaza during this temporary truce. So the idea is first you get this breakthrough, get the sides together, or I guess separate rooms, but close enough to hold talks, and hopefully in the coming days be able to move forward. But again, I think we still have this main, even if Hamas softens its points on issues of the aid that goes in and maybe allowing the UN or not allowing the UN to resume much of its operations, or the withdrawal of Israeli forces, maybe getting them not to go as far back as Hamas would like if they soften on those things, I still don't see, speaking to different sources involved, that they're likely to give up on this main issue of trying to make sure that the temporary truce eventually turns into something that's permanent. They want something more than just the word of the U.S. They want something real clear-cut guarantees, because they felt like that they didn't get that in January, and that led to Israel resuming the war in March. So I still think we're a lot of obstacles still to overcome, but it is noteworthy that various people involved made a point of saying that they are optimistic, and made a point of even sharing that optimism with the hostage families, knowing that this is a very fragile time, and I don't think they want to be just giving false hope.
I mean, stating that they're optimistic is also a diplomatic weapon in a way. It is a different lever, and it does put more pressure on Hamas. But from everything that you've been saying, and I've not studied these proposals as carefully as you have over these almost 20 months of war, I just wonder, is there any movement at all in terms of the broad strokes of the different sides? It just doesn't appear to me that there really is any movement at all.
Yeah, I think, and that's why the optimism is almost a strategy to your point. I think that is the goal right now, is to at least create an atmosphere of momentum that maybe can just push the sides forward. I think, I don't know why I'm connecting it, but like basically like with all the election talk, if you talk about it enough, I think it does eventually become a reality in Israel. I don't know if we're there yet, but I think there's a similar dynamic at play with these hostage negotiations, that just if you will it into being, that maybe that can be a factor in getting an actual deal on the table. But I think given the way that the parties still are fundamentally not fundamentally at odds on this key issue of whether this is a permanent ceasefire or a temporary one, it makes it very difficult to move forward.
Okay, we're going to go to a break and then discuss the humanitarian aid efforts on the ground.
What surprised you the most discovering about Jewish life in the United States?
I think it's the pride. I think I was envy of that pride. Just being proud, being a proud Jew. It's something that I never even contemplated. I was just an Israeli. I think the fact that, in Israel, we have all sort of sectors in society. You kind of grow up with your kind. I hate that. The fact that I don't know a lot about my Jewish life and I need to go abroad just to understand that. It's something so messed up and how we grew up here. It's just, I think, once it got political to be Jewish in Israel, it made me kind of push away from that. Once I got to LA, once I got just being with my daughters abroad, just understanding what we are, my heritage, where we come from, our story, our values. It took me a long time. It took me a long time to get there.
And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. Overnight, while we were sleeping, we heard a report from you, Jacob, that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation will not be resuming efforts today, at least in the early hours of today, right now. And this is for the second day. Of course, yesterday they announced that they were going to shut down operations in order to create a better atmosphere for handling the massive crowds that are coming and getting the aid after the many days of very cloudy, not really sure what's happening there, but definitely violence among the crowds, shooting at the crowds, not really sure what's happening there again. But Jacob, shed a little light on what's going on right now. What we do know for certain is that it's not opening this morning. So what's happening here?
Correct. So late last night, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, they put out a post on their Facebook page, which is in Arabic. This is one of the ways that they've been working to communicate with the Palestinian public, and saying basically that we will not be opening as early as we have in previous days. Previous 8 days that they've been operating. They don't say when they will reopen. A spokesperson separately told several reporters that they will be opening later in the day, possibly in the afternoon, but they don't say which of the sites will be open. Basically, they've been operating 3 sites over the past 8 days when they've been open since May 26th, but not all 3 sites have been open at a time. Only one day, I believe, maybe 2, were 3 sites open at the same time. Most days of this 8-day period have only seen 1 site open at once. And what this means, though, by having a lot of uncertainty about when and where these sites will be open, I think it leads to a lot more difficulty in terms of Gazans being able to try to reach some of these sites, because there's been a lot of testimony from people trying to travel dozens of kilometers that they have to do by foot, oftentimes through war zones that they are often hearing fire, sometimes even dodging Israeli fire to get there. But now they don't even know where they're going and when. I think it's going to make for more scenes of chaos, which is something that they're specifically trying to avoid. And the reason given for the delay is that they're talking about maintenance and repair work. My understanding is that this is to expand the capacity to be able to accommodate more people that have been flooding these sites, because we only have, sometimes if it's just 1 site a day and 2 million people, obviously not all 2 million are trying to get to these sites, but many, many thousands are. And you have testimony of Palestinians who are saying that they're going and they're just simply, the lines are too long and they're not even able to get food at the end of the day. And obviously you mentioned at the beginning, there's been shootings that under unclear circumstances, but it's been a dangerous, very dangerous task. And I think what the GHF, a spokesperson I spoke with, did say that they're trying to work with the IDF to try to boost its protocols, and maybe that this extra day, and I guess day and a half, will hopefully improve that to make this a safer experience. But I think this latest announcement just shows there's a lot of disorganization. It's a process that's going to take time to get upright, and hopefully, even though that there's another delay, that yes, there's also other aid coming in. I think there were several dozen trucks that came in yesterday, just below 100 even. So other formats of aid getting in, but clearly the situation remains dire.
This is only one of several efforts that we've seen over the course of these 20 months. Of course, most notoriously, shall we say, is the Biden pier off the coast of Gaza, which was eventually abandoned because it was unstable and basically not operational. And we've also seen airlift efforts, meaning air drops, actually. And that stopped pretty suddenly at one point during the war. And I just kind of wonder why nations such as Jordan, which was very instrumental in these airdrops and very proudly showed pictures of its king, and I believe the princess was actually on one of the flights, if not flying the airplane or something like that. Can't remember entirely. But why aren't these efforts being resumed during this very tough situation, this liminal period between the startup of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and the wind down of the other aid efforts, which Israel obviously accuses Hamas of co-opting? So why isn't there some other in-between situation like the airdrops, for example?
So on the airdrop specifically, I have noticed there are a couple Palestinian American activists who have called for their resumption. What I remember is that the criticism of the airdrops is that their actual impact is rather limited and they are extremely costly. And that therefore the focus was to try to flood the crossings, the land crossings themselves. And in addition, that they just simply require more coordination with the IDF, which I'm not sure is prepared to open its airspace for certain periods of time in order to allow these airdrops. But I guess a combination of all those factors has led to them not being used so much in recent months. But I think what the argument that some humanitarian organizations have been making is that really you should be, yes, even if the airdrops weren't that effective, it's part of a broader effort that you just flood the zone with aid. And that is another way that you theoretically combat Hamas diversion of aid, because if it becomes less scarce, then it's not much of an issue, even if Hamas is taking some of it, that there's just so much aid going into Gaza that actually that is less of an impact, and it's less of a monetary benefit for Hamas to even be getting its hands on it.
Right. It is obviously the interest of the United Nations efforts that have been working on the ground, and other nations perhaps as well, for this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to fail, right? Because this is the Israel/American backed effort to get the aid in, which would obviously drive so many people out of their very long-term jobs. I'm talking about, the UNRWA types and the types of other NGOs that have been working on the ground for decades, supporting this, gravy train society type situation in the Gaza Strip. But now we're in a different situation altogether. The situation is obviously very dire. Children are hungry. People are they're in distress, shall we say. And as the Israeli/American effort is starting to launch, it just confounds me. And I know I say this every time I speak with you. It confounds me that there is no goodwill or cooperation among the other efforts. And again, I will ask you, how do you explain that, Jacob?
I think there's valid points to what you're saying. I guess one argument that you hear some of these organizations make is that we simply cannot be complicit in this kind of effort that forces Palestinians to walk so far every day in order to pick up a box of aid that's dry food products that the GHF has been framing this as meals, but it's not really meals when they have to be basically prepared elsewhere. And they feel, I think, the World Central Kitchen, which was once, I think, more the darling amongst Israeli officials for the kind of aid organization that they appreciated. It was the UAE-backed group. That is one that does have these kitchens that's operating all throughout Gaza, and they feel that that's the framework. But saying that we're going to cooperate with a policy that is really enmeshed with the IDF, and we're seeing that kind of the friction in these past 3 days or earlier this week on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday that has led to that are contributed to some of these mass casualty incidents, even if the exact details are still unclear. The feeling is that it simply goes against what they call humanitarian principles to involve themselves in this kind of effort, which they feel simply puts Palestinians at risk.
So it's a matter of principle, shall we say. Let's shift gears slightly and talk about another situation in which Israel comes off, in my opinion, rather badly. And earlier in the week, there was a delegation, a planned delegation at least, to go to the West Bank. And it was a delegation led by Saudis of different Arab countries, foreign ministers, to meet with Palestinian Authority head Mahmoud Abbas. And Israel blocked this delegation for fears that it would legitimize the Palestinian Authority and essentially diverted the whole idea of this trip, which was to give the Palestinian Authority a bit more credence, especially looking at the day after the Gaza war, in hopes that the Palestinian Authority would pick up some of the reins of power there. So, Jacob, fill us in a little bit more. Give us the details from this very sketchy sketch that I just gave.
Yeah, it wasn't just trying to get the PA involved in Gaza, but also these are Arab countries in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan. I think the UAE was likely to send a representative, Turkey even, so not only Arab countries, but other countries in the region, and Qatar, an Israeli favorite, that were going to be willing to work with the PA, but also to play a role in the post-war management of Gaza, which is something that actually Israel has tried to secure. It argues that it recognizes, or at least parts of the Israeli government recognize, that Israel does not want to occupy Gaza permanently. They doesn't want to run the civil affairs in Gaza, and that therefore these countries could have a role to play that would be very beneficial. They talk about the Saudis specifically being involved in efforts to, quote unquote, de-radicalize the Palestinian public in Gaza and boost the education system there, similar to what it was done in Saudi Arabia itself. But these countries have a condition that the PA be involved. And the PA is something that is seen as a non-starter by this current Israeli government, which has looked to try and undermine the PA and kind of sideline it before October 7th and definitely afterwards. But against this backdrop, you had this visit that with these countries that were trying to basically, as you mentioned, boost the PA, but also talk about this conference that's going to be held later this month at the UN that's co-hosted by Saudi Arabia and France, that's aimed at boosting or efforts to advance a two-state solution. This is a big buzzword that Israel doesn't really like to hear about, and basically the reason that was given when a foreign ministry official briefed some reporters late on Friday night when this news dump took place was that we felt that this decision was going to, or this meeting was going to lead to the advancement of a Palestinian state, and that is something that we see as a security liability for Israel, and therefore we decided to block the visit. There was a ministerial meeting that Netanyahu held on Thursday night, where the decision was made, basically to block Israeli airspace to the helicopters that would have been coming from Jordan to Ramallah, carrying these foreign ministers for this meeting. But it definitely ticked off quite a bit of the various Arab parties involved, namely Saudi Arabia, which is a country that you seemed to, or at one point would have thought Israel didn't want to upset too much. There's a lot of desire, even amongst Netanyahu and his and broader circle, about trying to get a normalization deal. I'm not so sure how this is going to really advance that effort, specifically because MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, personally was kind of vouching for this trip and given it its public backing. And I think this was seen as kind of an embarrassment to the Crown Prince by blocking this trip. And you had the Israeli official talk about how the PA needs to adhere to its agreements with Israel, which I thought was a bit rich, given that there's quite a bit. Israel has reasons why it doesn't want to adhere to the Oslo agreements and different facets of it, but there are a lot of agreements that Israel on its part has not been adhering to. The tax revenues that doesn't transfer to the PA in full, or various actions that it's taking in Jerusalem, or just the refusal to allow population movement between the West Bank and Gaza. There's a lot of different clauses that Israel has not been adhering to, so it was interesting to hear that would be the reason why, one of the reasons used in this decision by the Israeli government to block the PA from hosting these ministers.
Jacob, really interesting stuff. And listeners, I strongly suggest that you take a look at the articles that I'm posting in the program notes. Jacob, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Amanda.
And good night.
Good morning.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow. Shalom.